I'll just give you a little background on myself. I'm Erica Nelson. I'm the project director for the Race to Equity Project, which is a project of the Wisconsin Council on Children and Families. That's a statewide policy nonprofit that works on issues of education, child welfare, juvenile justice, early ed, and does a lot of state of Wisconsin budget analysis. So the Race to Equity Project is a racial disparities project within that organization. And I'm a trained attorney, though not practicing, and I, before moving back to Wisconsin, was representing parents who were accused of abuse and neglect in Manhattan Family Court in the child welfare system. So that's sort of my other professional background, and now I'm doing policy work, as you can see. So I just will start with a question, and that is, I think you already have, you're familiar, right, with the report? So who's familiar with the Race to Equity report, or heard of it? Oh, great. Okay. So that's good, because then it's not starting totally from scratch. So, Rick, if you'll switch us to the next slide. Sorry. So about 2 years ago, actually 2 years ago last week, October 2013, we released our Race to Equity baseline report on racial disparities between African Americans and whites here in Dane County. And that report looked at 40 well-being measures or data indicators in economic well-being, education, child welfare, juvenile justice, the adult criminal justice system, health, family structure. And what we learned from collecting all this data and comparing African American well-being to white well-being is that Dane County is in fact home to some of the widest black-white disparities of any place in the United States. And African Americans here in Dane County not only lag far behind whites in terms of well-being, but actually fare less well and endure more negative life outcomes than blacks elsewhere in the nation. In other words, African Americans in Milwaukee or Chicago or Harlem or Oakland are actually faring better in terms of their outcomes than the African American community here. Next slide. So this is after the report came out. This is our report, and the State Journal did an article on how Madison area has some of the highest racial disparities in the nation. And in March of 2014, the Annie E. Casey Foundation released their own national report called Race for Results, and it compared all 50 states and looked at child well-being disaggregated by race and ethnicity, and the state of Wisconsin is the worst place nationally for African American well-being. And I have a few copies of those reports here, so you can look at that information within that report. So Dane County is essentially contributing to this national or statewide ranking. We are not an exception. Next one. So what I'm going to do is, and bear with me, and this is the part that's either overwhelming or too many numbers or hard to absorb, but I'm going to share with you some of the key findings that we found when we were looking and making these comparisons in terms of data. So we're going to do a quick demographic profile, and these are the 3-year American Community Survey numbers from the census. And so Dane County's population is about 500,000. The county's African American population is about 26,000. The African American child population numbered about 9,000, or 8.3% of the county's total child population. and they make up about 20 to 17% of the kids in our schools countywide. And just as an aside, we chose to compare African Americans and whites initially in this report for a number of reasons. Cultural competency, different historical factors produce different outcomes, different challenges, and required looking at different types of data. So we currently have collected probably 40 plus, 60 plus well-being measures for the Latino community here in Dane County as it compares to whites. And we will be working on a similar report and a similar engagement process over the course of the next year. So going back to some of our economic well-being numbers, I want you to envision, I don't know if anybody's heard of this phrase, the school to prison pipeline. Okay, so that's like it's a linear visual. And so what we like to think about in the Race to Equity Project is also that the pipeline isn't just from school to prison, it's an economic well-being issue as well, and it starts further up the pipeline. So in 2010 to 2012, the African American unemployment rate in Dane County averaged about 21.4%. The white unemployment rate for the same period was 5%. Black adults, in other words, were 4.5 times more likely to be without earnings than their white counterparts. And this black unemployment rate has consistently remained far higher than the national African American unemployment rate. And the African American male unemployment rate in the state is also the worst in the nation. So if you look at that graph, that sort of gives you a different way of thinking about it or visualizing it. So when we're thinking about unemployment, there are two groups. You can go to the next slide. There are two groups that are sort of left out of these numbers, and that would be those who are underemployed, who are working part-time, not necessarily out of choice, but of an inability to find full-time jobs. And most researchers agree that black workers make up a disproportionate share of these part-timers. And the unemployment figures exclude the very disproportionate number of African Americans who are incarcerated or in custody and therefore unable to provide earnings. And notably, a significant fraction of the unemployed African American population are mothers of young children who lack the supports and resources to balance full-time jobs and parenting on a sustainable basis. So this is just a slide to illustrate in last July 2014, there were conversations about a discrimination suit by the Madison Metro and 3 African American women, and this is to illustrate that also, not only is there a high unemployment, but we don't see a lot of African American folks in managerial positions in our systems. And when you're a manager or running a department, you also have the ability to inform your networks what jobs are available, what is coming in terms of a job announcement within your department, or recommend that someone apply. So this is also, the issue of networking in terms of employment is also a really important one to be thinking about. So poverty rate, high unemployment, we're going to have a high poverty rate. 41% of African Americans in Dane County are in poverty, and this is 14 points higher than the national black poverty rate, while the poverty rate for whites in Dane County is 9.5%. I would also argue that this white poverty rate, if we extracted the University of Wisconsin graduate student population who are filing their taxes, who would qualify as being potentially poor, we'd actually have a smaller percentage of our residents, our white residents that are in poverty. So if you look at this graph, that's another example of how we compare to the state of Wisconsin and the United States. And if you look at white poverty, it's less here than it is in the state of Wisconsin and in the United States. So moving on to child poverty. The black child poverty rate here averages almost 58%. Well over half of all the county's black children reside in below poverty households, and if you're under the age of 5, that poverty rate is likely to be even higher, while the child poverty rate for whites is about 5.6%. And again, this black child poverty rate for African Americans is 39%. The national child poverty rate for blacks is 39%. So therefore, 20 points less than our current child poverty rate. So there's the visual again. And then look at the white child poverty rate versus the African American, then compare it to Wisconsin and the U.S., and you see how big the gap is. Okay. Median family income. The median income of black families in Dane County was $27,000. This is about amounting to less than 1/3 the median family income of whites at $86,000. Okay, so that's a big gap. If we go to the graph, you will see the distance here again. Whites doing really well as comparison to other whites in the state of Wisconsin and in the nation, while African Americans are not doing as well, or not doing as well. Next slide. So this is a concept on the racialization of disadvantage. Dane County is a place where poverty and poor outcomes have an exceptionally strong correlation with race and color. Put another way, disadvantage here has become highly racialized. So many people say, well, isn't this a class argument and not a race argument? And I respond by saying, actually, here in Dane County, they're so inextricably linked that you can't pull them apart. And that we, therefore, associate poor outcomes and lower expectations with kids of color, regardless of their income status. So next slide. The cost of racializing disadvantage. Now, I believe that conscious racism may not have been the primary cause of why we're experiencing this degree of disparity here in the county. However, if it continues to perpetuate, it has the potential to foster stereotyping, profiling, or differential expectations based on color, which will exacerbate and deepen our racial equity challenge, and in many ways I feel that we're kind of already there, personally. So if we go to the next slide, this is an example of where the racialization of poverty does not necessarily just impact low-income people of color, but actually impacts African American professors, African American executives who are making millions of dollars, whose response to the Madison community is that, you know, I send my kids to school, there are lower expectations for my kids in school because they're African American. And that's it. Not that I have a degree, that I'm a professor, any number of things. And he actually in this article talks about that, as well as about how they were, because of this, in many ways his family was not happy or unhappy to be here. Now, so we've done the economic well-being. Now we're going to look at some of our school data as part of this pipeline. And as you know, a child's or a youth's experience in school is really important to their future success, and it is oftentimes a strong predictor of adolescent and adult involvement in the criminal justice system, but is also strongly correlated to family stress, underemployment, joblessness, and poverty in adult life. So I will share with you some of the indicators. This is third graders proficient in reading. So it's not last year anymore, it's 20, sorry. Fewer than 15% of Dane County's African American third graders scored proficient or better in reading, while 50% of all white students met this critical threshold. This is not positive for either whites or African Americans, but it's dismal for African Americans, and third grade reading is considered a really strong predictor of subsequent adequate academic success. And one of the things I always try to explain about why third grade reading is so important is because between the ages of 0 or birth and third grade, a child is absorbing, you know, there's a lot of information and research on brain development, but a child is absorbing all the tools it needs to learn how to read, right? Phonics, letters, writing, etc. So from 0 to third grade, you're learning to read. From third grade on, you are reading to learn. A math problem, science, social studies, any number of things is absorbed now through reading. And if you are not proficient, it becomes difficult, it becomes frustrating, it becomes a struggle, you know? So there's a lot to be said about thinking about third grade reading and how its impact or lack of proficiency is impacting the rest of the academic success and frustrations and behaviors within the class, right? I mean, I couldn't go into a chemistry class and sit down and feel great about it because I have no knowledge to build upon in order to absorb that information. So 8th graders proficient in math, very similar. 19% of black 8th graders tested proficient or better in math, while almost 68% of white students met this critical threshold. Math proficiency in 8th grade is an important indicator of readiness for college-bound success in school. So, but there has been some encouraging improvements as of 2014, which we've been updating our numbers. And that is that there is an encouragement in terms of proficiency levels, and the proficiency for 8th grade math is up about 5 percentage points. And 3rd grade reading is also slowly improving as well, so that's a great sign. Chronic absences. If you're not in the classroom, you're not learning. And therefore, it's strongly correlated with subsequent academic struggles and disappointments. And for the Madison Metropolitan School District, 36% of African American students were reported as chronically absent compared to 12% of white students. If you move on to rate of suspensions, we're getting newer numbers on rate of suspensions as a result of the Madison Metropolitan School District implementing a new behavioral education plan, which was targeted at addressing disparities in suspensions. But as of 2011, suspensions were more than 15 times as likely to involve an African American student as a white student, and suspensions are strongly correlated to dropping out of school and future juvenile justice involvement. Next one, this is an article that they did in November of last year about the suspension policy. Having implemented this new suspension policy, suspensions were down 51% overall, okay? So this policy change resulted in a massive reduction in overall suspensions. However, the disparity remained. It was still a disproportionate number of African American kids as compared to white students. Failure to graduate on time. As you know, the 21st century economy, high school graduation is oftentimes not enough to get a living wage paying job. And in the 2012-2013 school year, 42% of Dane County's black high schoolers failed to graduate on time. In other words, they were 3.3 times more likely to miss this key benchmark than their white peers. And this 42% rate was worse than the statewide African American failure to graduate rate. Though we believe this too is improving by slow percentage points, and I really think that is because people are now more focused on equity and addressing disparities and really targeting policies and action plans towards addressing them. So this is just an example of like how we've made a little bit of improvement in the past few academic years. So as overwhelming as these numbers are, I'm also trying to say that we are making slow progress in the right direction. So as percent of students taking the ACT, this is another example of where we've made great progress. In 2013-2014 school year, just over 51% of eligible African American students in Dane County took the ACT. While this disparity needs to be narrowed, in 2013-2014, the number of African American students had increased by 22 percentage points in comparison to the prior school year. In other words, in 1 year, because of a policy change that the Madison Metropolitan School District made, we had 22% more African American students taking the ACT. And as you know, in order to get into secondary education, to get into college, you have to take the ACT or the SAT. Before, I think it was closer to like 68 or 69%, something like that, of African American students who weren't taking it. And what the Madison Metropolitan School District did was they removed the fee for taking the ACT, and they said, you know what? Only juniors are going to show up on this one day, and every junior will get the test. The freshmen, the sophomores, and the seniors don't come to school. This is our focus, this is the day we're going to do it, and the fee will be waived. And as a result, we had a huge increase in 1 year in the number of African American kids taking the ACT. So, that's an example. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide. And so I've sort of talked about economic well-being and education, and if you're thinking about the pipeline, we sort of begin to move into what I term the deep end systems. That's the child welfare or foster care system, that's the juvenile justice system, and that's our adult criminal justice system. And in many ways, the numbers that I will share with you momentarily are a reflection of some of the disparities we just saw in education and in economic well-being. So the systems are absorbing many of these inequities at their front door. Okay. Children in foster care in 2011, we're working on updating our numbers on this from the Dane County Human Services. There were 124 Dane County African American children in foster care compared to 58 white children. This means an African American child was approximately 15 times more likely to be in foster care than a white child. And black children make up about 9% of the county's total child population. They typically constituted nearly 60% of all children in placement on any given day in 2011. Okay, so these are newer numbers for juveniles referred to the Juvenile Reception Center. So there were 544 referrals to the Dane County Juvenile Youth Reception Center involving an African American youth compared to 200 referrals involving a white youth. And while black youth, and the difference in sort of the percentages between youth and child is that youth gets, they're not going to send a 5-year-old to the juvenile detention center. So we have you're going to send a teenager. So about 8.4% of the county's total youth population are represented by black youth, but they were involved in 63% of all referrals to the Juvenile Reception Center, 22 times more likely to have a referral that involves a black youth than a white youth. Now, these are juveniles placed in county secure detention pending disposition. Disposition meaning, you're in sentencing, except in juvenile court it's not called a sentencing, it's an adjudication. So this is before that sentencing happens. So there were 340 placements in county secure detention involving African American youth compared to 90 admissions involving white youth. African American youth accounted for 8.4% of the total county population, but accounted for 73% of all detention admissions. 28 times more likely to have a black youth in detention than a white peer, right? So if you went downtown and you visited the detention center, most of the faces you'd see would be African American. So if we move on to the adult criminal justice system, in 2012, African American adults were more than 8 times more likely to be arrested than whites in Dane County, and we did numbers for this in March this last year for Madison, and it's about 11 times more likely if you're African American in Madison. And we also have the highest African American male incarceration rate in the nation. So once you get arrested, you're more likely to be charged, sentenced, incarcerated. And I think that our high African American male incarceration rate also has to do with violations of probation. In other words, you violate, you go back into the system. And some of these violations have nothing to do with committing a crime. It's literally like there's circumstances where the GPS monitor goes haywire, and so the system thinks that you have stepped outside of some kind of boundary when in fact you haven't, and that's technically a violation of your probation, and then you are sent back into the system. So there's a lot of room for reform. So I'll just make some observations about our defense systems. These disproportionate outcomes are markers of the presence of profound inequities in our community. And like I just said, they cry out for action and reform. And much of this reform must come from within these systems themselves. I believe our child welfare system can do more to strengthen vulnerable families, to intervene earlier in times of family crisis and more effectively, to find safe ways to keep children at home with their families. There are also more things that our police, our prosecutors, our courts, and corrections agencies can do to lessen their disproportionate surveillance, apprehension, prosecution, and incarceration of youth and adults of color. So while I really sincerely believe that there's a lot of reforms that can take place within all of these systems, the child welfare, juvenile justice, adult criminal justice system, to address disparities, I think that it is not the best idea to rely just on those systems to fix these inequities. But in fact, we need to look at how other systems and other institutions are contributing to these disadvantages. So in other words, these tragic and deep disparities are the fruit of a tree that has deep structural, institutional, cultural, and economic roots. So, that being said, there's just a moment to acknowledge history, and that is the legacy of slavery, which is 2.5 centuries of bondage, 100 years of segregation, discrimination, and exclusion, and 50 years of persisting racism that is embedded in our attitudes, economy, politics, institutional practices, and social structures are very much contributing to these disadvantages for the African American community. And that is true for folks here in Dane County, but it's also true for African American folks throughout the nation, right? However, I think there are some local factors that are contributing to our racial disparities that are particular to Madison. And so, first of all, before I get into the first one, the labor market mismatch, I just want to go back to sort of visualizing and thinking about the charts that you saw. When we started this project and started looking at the data, we knew more or less, or had this hypothesis, that the disparities would be great. They'd be pretty significant. We did not suspect that the disparities would be so vast. And what was happening was that African Americans on average were faring less well here than comparison to other African Americans in other cities, and whites do better on average than whites elsewhere in the state of Wisconsin and in the nation. So you have this sort of tugging at each end, right? So the rising tide of white well-being was not lifting all boats, right? And so that's why people are like, how can we possibly have the worst disparities? Well, it's a distance. Disparities are a distance, a likelihood, right? And because whites are doing significantly better on average, that's why you get this great distance, okay? In addition, we have a labor market mismatch. Going back to our unemployment numbers, there is something to be said for the fact that we are a university town. We are the head of state and city government. We have our industries are biotech, IT, federal research grants from the university. And therefore, these are all highly credentialed jobs. These are jobs that on average require a master's degree, right? And we have a lot of wonderful people who are graduating from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with their graduate degrees and say, this town is so awesome, I'm never leaving, okay? So they never leave, and it's a comfortable place to live, to play, to work, and so you apply to a job in some ways that you're overqualified for with your master's degree. Whether that's an administrative assistant position or a position at a restaurant. I mean, the myth of PhDs driving cabs is not a myth here. It's actually, that's exactly what's happening. And so jobs that would be available that are more entry level to those folks that don't have master's degrees, that are less networked in terms of their social networks to say, oh, hi, here, give me a job. Oh, yeah, someone told me that someone was being hired, is not really taking place here. That's why I think we have some significant unemployment issues. And in fact, on average, African Americans here fare better than African Americans elsewhere in terms of having a high school diploma, right? So our average is better than Chicago's average for high school diplomas. So it begs the question, what's happening with our labor market? Neighborhood isolation is another factor. In big cities, Southside Chicago, Harlem, Oakland, Milwaukee, you have large neighborhoods, blocks and blocks and blocks long of concentrations of people of color. And in those neighborhoods, whether they're majority low income or what have you, there are institutions, churches, grocery stores, places of employment, neighborhood schools, transportation. I could go on. And here in Dane County, we often have what we term enclaves, small concentrations of low-income folks of color that are essentially isolated in 4-block radiuses, surrounded by white middle-class homes with no transportation, no neighborhood school, no places of employment. So like, for example, if we think about, like, I'm a high school junior and I want to get a summer job. So in a big city, you might go down to the corner and say, hey, can I work in the bodega for the summer to get some experience on my resume? That networking that is in places and neighborhoods that are bigger and more urban than ours do not necessarily exist here. And lastly, I think we need to increase our cultural competency and our resources for within our family and child serving systems. We need more money going into these social services. We need more people that have greater cultural competency and work from a strengths perspective as opposed to a deficit perspective. So skip the next slide because it's big and I'm running out of time. So I took you on this linear pipeline, visual. Now I want you to take the pipe and I want you to turn it into a circle, okay? Because essentially, it's not linear. Our well-being is influencing schools. Schools are influencing our deep end systems, but coming out of incarceration is therefore influencing employment. Economic well-being. It's all circular. It's actually all connected, and it's like, this is my best graphic version, but like turning it into a circle or thinking about it as a web of interrelated institutions and systems. Having employment is one thing, but if you don't have childcare, because we don't have enough quality, affordable childcare, you don't stay employed for very long, right? If you have a job, but then it turns out that the transportation isn't available to the job, there you go. That's a missing piece of the puzzle. And technically, it's outside the system of employment, right? So that it's all very much integrated and needs to be thought of as working together. Next slide, quickly. Let's just see what I have left. 2-generation strategy. This is sort of our action plan. We need to not only focus our money, resources, and efforts on children, but we also need to focus them on the parents, because parents are contributing and assisting based on their level of stress and resources to their child's well-being and to their community's well-being. So I always say, let's not leave the parents behind. Let's think about that and think about it now. Let's not just, and I think that's, we think about it in terms of, well, in 5 years we'll have more people graduating, and they will be the future. Like, well, what about right now, right? So we have this action plan that we're rolling out, and it has 3 goals, which are not on here, but I'll just go over them. Enhancing employment and earnings for those that are underemployed or unemployed. Supporting working parents by providing the resources they need to meet the demands of their job and of parenting, and increasing those same parents' children's success in school, right? So that's the part of the 2 generation. And our principles and values that need to inform all of our efforts to address the racial equity challenge. Engage the families and communities most effective. Oftentimes we don't target. We feel like everything's for everyone in this community because we're so wonderfully progressive and intellectual, and yet we leave out a huge number of the people that we're supposed to be doing the program for. 2-generation strategy, like I said, it needs to be comprehensive and collaborative, not siloed. That goes back to the sort of integration of all the systems. Targeted, I just said, and given the depth and breadth of our problems, our responses had to be driven by urgency. I think we're at a crisis point, but also a sense that this has to be a sustained and long-term commitment. We did not get here overnight. This did not happen in the last 5 years. These numbers that I've shared with you have existed in this community for 30 plus years. You can go back to articles written in 1986 in the paper where they say, in the State Journal, where they go through this, and it's the same numbers. So lastly, on a happy note, this is Bo Ryan. And I like this man a lot as a coach because he coaches in the sense that everyone has a role to play. You know, maybe last year was an exception because Kaminsky was the star. But normally there's not one star player that's taking on the entire load for the team, but rather they're all working together simultaneously towards the goal of winning, and everyone on the team knows the role that they're supposed to play. And I think that's a model that we can take for this community. We all need to be pushing forward towards a shared agenda of reducing racial disparities, and we all need to work together, and we need to work simultaneously forward. So that is my presentation in a nutshell. It's a snapshot of the last of our work, and I could provide you with tons more information on all the incredible, wonderful, positive initiatives that have taken place since the release of the report in October of 2013. So, thank you.